Ah, the seven wonders of the ancient world. The seven things every tourist had on their bucket list 2,000 years ago. You've probably heard that all of them are gone now, except for the pyramids of Giza, which are ironically the oldest of them by far. But what if I told you that the other wonder in Egypt, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, still sorta exists? And I don't just mean that a few blocks from it are still sitting around somewhere, I mean that it's still standing and you can still climb up it, in a way. The only thing is, this lighthouse isn't really the original, but it's pretty much a scale model, so just like how you can still technically call the Eiffel Tower in Las Vegas the Eiffel Tower, even though it isn't the original, you can technically sort of call this mini-lighthouse of Alexandria the Lighthouse of Alexandria. But before we delve into the mini-lighthouse, we've got to look into what made the OG lighthouse so special, and what eventually happened to it. And since this video is all about how the Lighthouse of Alexandria sort of still exists, we'll be looking into what tantalizing traces of the actual lighthouse still survive. The Pharos Lighthouse was the big solution to a big problem. Lower Egypt has a shallow, mostly featureless coast studded with submerged rocks and sandbanks. This wasn't just dangerous, it meant that there were no landmarks ancient mariners could use to figure out which part of the coast they were off. But there was one exception, a limestone outcropping shielding a good harbor which would become known as the island of Pharos. It was even mentioned as this by Homer in the Odyssey, because Menelaus was stranded there with a bunch of smelly seals apparently after the sack of Troy. Plutarch even claims that Alexander the Great put Alexandria where it is today because Homer himself appeared to him in a dream and quoted what he wrote about the Pharos. Alexander even originally intended the city to be on the island itself, but since it was too small, he instead built it over a small fishing village called Rhocotis, which was sheltered by it. After Alexander died, Egypt wound up in the hands of one of his generals, Ptolemy. He would go on to start Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty, which was based at Alexandria. So, in order to reveal the entrance of Alexandria's main eastern harbor at night and to one of the shallow waters around it, Ptolemy decided to start construction on a huge lighthouse on the Pharos, which is what it became known as. The lighthouse became known as the Pharos. In addition to its practicality, it would also serve as a handy way of advertising Alexandria's wealth and splendor to all who passed through it. It took Ptolemy 800 talents of silver, or about 21,000 kilograms of the stuff, to build it. Unfortunately, he died before it was completed, and it wasn't finished until the reign of his son Ptolemy II, sometime in the 290s or 280s BC. But it was definitely worth the price. The base of the lighthouse measured 340 by 340 meters, and it could have been up to 435 feet high, making it the tallest building in the ancient world after, of course, the pyramids of Khufu and Khafre at Giza. It was so recognizably tall that in a satirical play written by Lucian, a character that ascends to the moon is only able to recognize the Earth because he can see the Pharos. In fact, it was so recognizable, period, that derivatives of the word Pharos are still used to refer to lighthouses and headlights in general in several European languages, and word of how amazing the lighthouse was even reached ancient China. The Pharos was made up of 4 stories, a square one at the bottom, a shorter octagonal one above that, and a shorter circular one on top of that, and then the floor with the beacon and its reflecting mechanisms. We know this because throughout its lifetime it was depicted on things ranging from coins to mosaics to terracotta lamps, sort of like the Eiffel Tower or Big Ben. The beacon was a fire that was kept burning continuously and made more intense during the day by a burnished bronze mirror and maybe some other delicate mechanisms. The light from the fire could flash 54 kilometers or 34 miles out to sea, which may not sound like a whole lot, but that was a day's sail away at the time. It was so bright that apparently it was easily mistaken for a star in the night sky, according to Pliny. During the day, the smoke from the fire also served to help guide mariners. The guy who designed the lighthouse was a certain Sostratus of Cnidos. According to Pliny and Strabo, the Ptolemies actually let him add an inscription to it naming him as its builder, but according to Lucian, he had to hide the inscription in a rather sneaky way. He claims that Sostratus covered it with some gypsum, which he in turn covered with an inscription naming one of the Ptolemies, knowing that eventually the outer one would fall away, leaving his own in full view. This is likely an apocryphal story, and ironically, it's meant to be an allegory about writing history. But surprisingly enough, this very inscription may have actually survived to the present, despite the Pharos itself not existing anymore. And here's why that, unfortunately, is the case. The Pharos Lighthouse stood for 1,700 years, but over time it was slowly eroded by at least 20 different earthquakes, and those are just the ones recorded in Arab sources from after the Eastern Roman Empire lost Alexandria in 641. It's even been theorized that minarets are inspired by the Pharos' design. Traditional Egyptian minarets are square at the bottom, octagonal at their center, and round at their top, like the Pharos. After all, Alexandria was one of Islam's earliest great prizes. However, the first minaret to imitate the Pharos' general shape was built in the 14th century when the Pharos was nearly destroyed, as we'll get into, and they more likely derived from Syrian church towers. But even if that wasn't the case, Greco-Roman and Islamic travel writers alike were fascinated by the Pharos and made up a bunch of different tall tales about it. Like how you could see the streets of Byzantium from a special lens at its top, or that the chambers at its bottom were so numerous that you could get lost in them forever without a guide. These Islamic travel writers also documented the tower's gradual collapse. In the early 10th century, the geographer al-Masudi wrote in his work Meadows of Gold that part of the tower and the mirror at the top were destroyed by a caliph looking to find treasure within it. Later, he wrote that this was just the result of earthquakes, like the major one that hit Alexandria in 796, and he also mentions that the tower had already been restored at that point. Abu Hamid al-Garnati made a simple drawing of the Pharos when he visited Alexandria in 1117. It shows how the entrance was elevated above ground level and reached by a great ramp. Additionally, this guy also claimed that the mirror was still around, that it could even be used to watch ships on the other side of the Mediterranean, which it could apparently light on fire, so maybe the veracity of his account isn't that great. Another 12th century geographer named al-Idrisi also commented upon the Pharos, and his account may indicate a fire was still being tended to at the top. A lot of these Arabic sources also happen to mention a Greek inscription in lead or bronze visible on the Pharos. Sound familiar? They also mention how the stones that made up the tower were clamped together with lead. The Spanish writer al-Balawi wrote the most detailed account we have of the Pharos in 1165, after it had been restored yet again and was standing more or less intact. He even measured the different sections of the Pharos by dropping a string attached to a stone from various points along it. As a result, we know that the Pharos had to be either 435 or 348 feet tall, depending on the exact length of the measurement he was using, which is still debated. By al-Balawi's time, a small mosque or oratory had been added to the top of the Pharos, which might be depicted in this magnificent mosaic depiction of it, ironically in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, made around 1200. But by the 13th century, the earthquakes had really started to take a toll on the Pharos, and people even started commenting on how ordinary it now seemed, and dismissed earlier accounts of how amazing it was as exaggerations or even lies. By 1273, even the first story had fallen into neglect and had to be restored. The famous traveler Ibn Battuta saw it twice in the 14th century, which wound up being the last century of its existence. When he first saw it in 1326, he found that even though one of its faces was in ruins, he could still enter it and look at all the many chambers within. But when he came back to Alexandria in 1349, he reported that the Pharos was in such a ruinous condition that entering it was just no longer possible. Finally, a major earthquake in 1375 reduced whatever was left to rubble and shook it down to its base. The Pharos' foundations are now occupied by a fortress built by the Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Kate Bey a century later in 1480. Or rather, that's what's generally believed. However, the actual remains of the lighthouse show that it was a bit further to the northeast, and its old position is now underwater. But that doesn't mean the OG Pharos is completely gone. There are still traces of it in the citadel of Kate Bey. The mosque sitting at the fortress's center is oriented according to the Pharos' original alignment towards the four cardinal directions instead of towards Mecca, as mosques usually are. It's also been said that looking above while you're in the mosque is like looking at the ghost of the pharaohs, and I have to agree. I mean, just look at this. In addition, some granite columns built into the walls of the fortress were probably once a part of the temple of the harbor's protective deity, Isis Pharia, whose temple once stood close to the pharaohs and who's named after the island of Pharos. But the astonishing actual remnants of the pharaohs can still be found scattered in the waters surrounding the citadel. The existence of the lighthouse's remains underwater were confirmed back in 1968 by underwater archaeologist Honor Frost as part of a UNESCO-sponsored expedition. And since 1994, more than 3,000 of the huge masonry fragments littering the harbor's seafloor have been surveyed by Jean-Yves Empereur, director of the French Center for Alexandrian Studies. And I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying huge. Mere fragments of individual blocks weigh 20 to 30 tons, meaning the mainly granite blocks that made up the pharaohs were some of the largest ever used in the ancient world. Complete ones can be 60 or 70 tons. More specifically, sections of a monumental red granite gateway and a marble fragment of a Greek inscription with letters once inlaid in bronze have been discovered. Sound familiar? This might actually be Sistratus' original inscription, the one all the Islamic writers mentioned. The letters were 30 centimeters high, so it was a huge inscription, but the letters themselves haven't survived, just the traces of them in the marble. Apparently it was published around the year 2000 by an American scholar, but I have nothing else to go on from there, so if anyone can help me track pictures of this thing down, I'd very much appreciate the help. Also, 6 fragmentary colossal statues were found in situ just east of Kate Bay's citadel. They were made in the 2nd century BC and represent 3 Ptolemaic royal couples. The combination of Greek and Egyptian sculpture combined with how worn they are give them a pretty neat aesthetic, eh? Dozens of sphinxes recycled from much earlier eras of Egyptian history, probably taken from Heliopolis near Cairo, were also discovered, as well as some obelisk fragments. Some of these are currently displayed and stored in Alexandria, but the rest of the Pharos is still underwater. That doesn't mean you can't visit it though. From what I've seen, it's now an underwater archaeological park that you can actually dive into. But that's not the only reason why the Pharos still sorta exists. Remember how I said there was a mini version of the Pharos in Egypt at the beginning? Well, we're about to talk about that now. And it's known as the Pharos of Abusir. It's some 30 miles to the west of Alexandria on the road from Alexandria to Marsa Matruh, near the small town of Abusir. Its design is clearly modeled off of that of the Pharos, with its square, octagonal, and cylindrical stories, but there are some minor differences. Unlike the original Pharos, it doesn't have windows, and of course, its internal structure is a bit less impressive, but it's the closest thing we have to the actual Pharos in its prime. Still though, there's a lot of mystery surrounding this, and even the date of its construction isn't known, as well as the very purpose it served. The Abusir it's named after isn't the same place as the famous Old Kingdom royal necropolis, also called Abusir, just south of Cairo, and it's actually much better known by another name, Toposiris Magna. That's because for decades, archaeologist Kathleen Martinez has been searching for the long-lost tomb of Cleopatra at the Temple of Osiris there, which is why every so often you might see some news story claiming that the tomb of Cleopatra is about to be discovered or something, even though we still have no idea where it is or if it even still exists. The temple actually sits on top of the same hill as the mini-Pharos, which overlooks the Mediterranean coast to the north and Lake Mariut, or Mariotis, to the south. Also, they were both built using white limestone from a quarry located around midway between the two. The Pharos of Abusir is of course much smaller than the original Pharos, and it's thought to be between 1/10 and 1/5 the scale of it. Prior to being restored in the 30s, it rose to a height of 17 meters, and nowadays it's around 20 meters or 66 feet high. Before being restored, only the western side of the tower remained, and some additions made during the reconstruction were made to facilitate entry by visitors, but they don't seem to have done that bad of a job, and you can clearly see which blocks are ancient and which were put there to bring back its original look. The purpose of the Pharos of Abusir has been up for debate since Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, with various scholars proposing that it was a lighthouse like the original, a signal tower used to defend Egypt from enemy threats, or a funerary monument meant to bring glory to some long-forgotten big cheese. Since it looks exactly like the most famous lighthouse of all time, and it's near both the sea and a big lake, you might assume it was a lighthouse, and many scholars over the years have thought the same thing. But turns out, this probably wasn't the case. There's a bunch of evidence debunking this. First of all, the location it's in isn't actually that good for a lighthouse. It sits 2 kilometers from the sea and 1.5 kilometers from the nearby ancient lake port on Lake Mariut, where oil, dates, wine, and beer from the Western Delta and the oases were all shipped to. But the whole point of the OG Pharos was to show ships the direction they needed to go in order to sail into port. The OG Pharos stood right next to the entrance of Alexandria's eastern harbor, and it didn't even serve the city's other western port, Port Eustanos, which is now its main port. There isn't even any archaeological or literary evidence for a seaport at Abusir, since the coast there was rocky and unfit for it. You might think then that it could have warned mariners of the rocky headland, but that probably isn't the case since there were no other towers like it from Alexandria to Libya, despite all the other rocky headlands, submerged rocks, and ridges between them. And it probably didn't serve the lake port either, for the same reason, and because there just wasn't any need for a lighthouse like that. Alexandria had a very important lake port where more came into it than from the coastal port, and that didn't need a lighthouse, so why would one be built at Abusir? And there's another strange thing about its location. The Pharos of Abusir sits in the middle of a huge cemetery, and in fact it sits right on top of the largest subterranean tomb within that cemetery. We'll get more into this in a sec, but when do you ever see a lighthouse in the middle of a cemetery? And plus, we know people were being buried in that cemetery after the lighthouse was built, so it wasn't like it was abandoned or anything. In addition, the spaces on top of the building and inside its 3 stages are just too narrow to store the huge quantities of fuel necessary to keep a fire going continuously. And the narrow spiral staircase going up the mini-Pharos is hard for a single person to get up even without carrying tons of fuel. This raises the question of why the pylons of the nearby temple weren't used for the same purpose, since they stand on the same hill and are actually internally wider. It's also been suggested that the tower was used to warn Alexandria of any incoming foreign threats coming from the west, but that just doesn't really make much sense since the Ptolemies ruled Libya, and if it really was supposed to be some sort of watchtower, it's a bit too close to Alexandria to be of much use, eh? And it's also east of the temple, meaning that the watchtower would be safe, while the uber-sacred temple would have been ransacked by these hypothetical foreign threats. It's been proposed that it was maybe part of a series of signal towers lining the coast from Alexandria to Cyrene in Libya, but that just didn't exist. There are no other signal towers between them. It seems most likely that the Pharos of Abusir is actually a funerary monument, since there's a tomb right beneath it. The tomb features a wide, long courtyard on the same axis as the tower, and a doorway at its end leading to a large burial chamber with niches in 3 of its walls. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any pictures of it. We have no idea who it actually belongs to, but since the tower overlooks the lakeside port, it may belong to merchants or ship owners or maybe a sea captain or something like that, but that's just conjecture. Ultimately, some big cheese from Taposiris Magna or maybe Alexandria wanted to draw attention to his tomb and maybe to create a new landmark for the town and to emphasize the importance of the necropolis as a whole. The necropolis also seems to have had an important link to the Temple of Osiris, and an ancient road even connects the two. But we still don't know when exactly the tower and the tomb were built. But we know it had to have been sometime during the Ptolemaic dynasty or soon after Egypt came under Roman rule. Unfortunately, I haven't heard of anything being found in the tomb under the tower, but this time span is based on the pottery found around the cemetery. Some scholars have dated the tower more specifically to the 1st century of Ptolemaic rule, so right around when the original Pharos was built, because the white limestone blocks it's made out of are the same as the ones used to build the nearby temple, which is also assigned to around the beginning of Ptolemaic rule. As I said before, they also came from the same quarry, which is midway between them, and they also both utilize a type of whitish-gray mortar used in the early Ptolemaic period. Another reason why the Pharos of Abusir has been dated to soon after the construction of the OG Pharos is that a fresco depicting a lighthouse labeled in a mid-Ptolemaic hand was found nearby. But this isn't a depiction of the Pharos of Abusir, it's just a depiction of the actual Pharos. Notice the windows, which is what it's labeled as. Plus, the tomb it was found in has nothing to do with the tomb under the tower, so really this painting has nothing to do with the tower. The tower and the temple also probably weren't built at the same time either. The temple was built using ashlar masonry, while the tower was built from alternating courses of headers and stretchers. This might actually be a clue to when the tower was built, though. According to the classical architect Vitruvius, the Greeks gave up ashlar masonry for building with courses of headers and stretchers. In turn, that style was dropped right after the Augustan age at the beginning of the 1st century AD. But the blocks that make up the tower are still equal in measurement to the blocks that make up the temple, and they're cut just as smooth, unlike the roughened surfaces of early imperial monuments. As such, the Pharos of Abusir was probably built not too long after the temple and the OG Pharos, probably sometime in the 2nd or early 1st century BC, while the Ptolemies were still running around. And that's why I can confidently say that the Lighthouse of Alexandria still sorta exists. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed and maybe learned something new. There is actually another very well preserved and very cool ancient Roman tower closely modeled off the Pharos, but it's in northwestern Spain and not Egypt, so it's pretty much out of the scope of my channel, even though I also do love the Roman Empire, don't forget that. Stay tuned and I'll see you soon with more videos about the land of the Pharaohs and its mysteries.